This is Radio 4. The 1993 Reith Lectures, called Representations of the Intellectual, start next week. Here to introduce the theme of the lectures and the man who'll be giving them on Radio 4 is James Naughtie.
This year's Reith Lecture springs from outside the Western intellectual tradition, but he's now at the heart of it. Professor Edward Said is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York, and a prolific scholar and commentator on literary and cultural matters. Yet he stands there, in one sense, as an outsider. He's a Palestinian Arab, born in Jerusalem, and a passionate advocate of self-determination for his people. A stand which, of course, has given a sharp edge to his teaching and his scholarship. It's also embroiled him in more or less perpetual controversy as an object of attack by those who say that too much of his work has been the simple statement of a political credo. Well as literary criticism, he has written several books on Islam and the Arab world, looking, for example, at how they're seen by Western societies and the cultural implications of the tension that produces. And all these themes, in a characteristically broad sweep, come together in this year's series of lectures, which are on the subject of the role of the intellectual in public life. Professor Said is with me now. First of all, why is the question of the place of the intellectual one which is relevant to us today in 1993?
Well, I think in the 20th century, the intellectual has really become a kind of all-purpose figure. There are intellectuals who are broadcasters, intellectuals as consultants, intellectuals as policy advisors, intellectuals as academics, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to be trying to do in the Reith Lectures is really to see, is there some more specific role that the intellectual plays, not as a technician, but rather as a moral and, strictly speaking, intellectual presence.
And as, above all, an original thinker. Is that
Right.
something that you see as being central to the idea of the intellectual?
Absolutely. I think I wouldn't only call it original, I'd call it somebody who thinks for himself or herself. In other words, not somebody who follows other people, but who tries to work things through intellectually and to do it with a relative amount of independence. I think the independence is very important. That, in other words, not the intellectual not as a simply a special pleader for a class or a corporate interest or governmental interest, but somebody who is aligned with different, let's say, movements, but in the end really thinks independently.
And gets close to the truth? Or is that something which
That's
is
very
an
tough.
abstraction?
No, the truth I don't think is an abstraction when it comes to things like, for example, massacres or invasions. I mean, I think those have to be called by their names. But, of course, nobody is an intellectual in the way that, say, Socrates was, or the way perhaps Jesus was, just standing above and pontificating from the hill or the mount or whatever. But I think what makes it interesting is that the intellectual is not only a secular figure, but somebody who's deeply involved in the world. There's a quality of worldliness to the intellectual.
Is one of the problems that you're trying to tackle here, the changing role of the intellectual in life, in society, the conclusion that in modern times there has been an enormous confusion about what the intellectual life is and where it fits in with our ordinary doings?
Absolutely. I mean, I think intellectual activity has just redoubled itself in the last, say, 40 years, since World War II, to an astonishing degree that I think now, for example, knowledge production, in America at least, is now 60% of the GNP. So that there are many more intellectuals than there are, say, factory workers, right? But my feeling is that the intellectual has a vocation in the strict sense, which is not a professional vocation, but one that I prefer to call an amateur vocation, that the intellectual is moved by passion, by affection, by commitment, rather than, getting paid a salary to give an opinion and be an expert.
Is the commitment more important than a concern for ideas per se?
Well, no. I think ideas make the commitment, and above all, it's not just any idea, but critical ideas. I mean, in other words, I think solidarity is terribly important, but never solidarity before criticism. In other words, solidarity and criticism. In other words, the intellectual has to have room, even one who is committed to a cause, let's say, or an idea, has to have room to move around, to question, to change his mind.
Now, people are going to be able to listen to the argument in full in the 6 lectures, but if you can distill what you're saying, what you have concluded, what you've discovered in your own mind by this re-examination of themes that have been of concern to you for many years, what have you come up with, do you think?
Well, I've come up with a pattern, really, in many ways, of things, A, to avoid. I think, for example, to worship a God that will always fail, to recant publicly. to espouse one cause and then the next day say, well, I'm sorry I did all of that, I was wrong, I'm hanged. I think that's deeply offensive and violates the idea of it. Neither should the intellectual be a technical expert, somebody who just gets paid to think for others. So the conclusion to this is, yes, there is a path of consistency, of commitment, with critical skepticism and independent judgment that is sometimes very difficult to maintain. And perhaps the central idea is the intellectual in this world has to be a kind of outsider, cannot be too much at home anywhere.
Well, I'll come back to that in a moment with respect to your own history, but in writing the lectures and in conceiving the argument in the way that you've done, who are you talking to? You see, quite often, distinguished academics like yourself are writing very scholarly works for your fellows, for gifted students too, right, but not for the general reader at all. Now, here you are delivering lectures which will be heard and read subsequently by many, many people. Are you trying to say, as well as arguing a case as forcefully as you can, for those of you who don't see yourselves as part of the intellectual life, there is something which is important for you in thinking about how you look at the intellectual life with respect to the way you do your daily business?
Absolutely. A large part of what I set out to do in these lectures is really to talk about habits of mind that can apply to everyone, to students, to young people, let's say. Right? I think one of the great problems today is a kind of inculcation of authority, that people are taught to accept certain things without criticism, ideas about tradition, about who we are in the national sense, patriotism, tradition, nationalism, those ideas. I think what I have to say about intellectuals is directly pertinent to questions of this sort, namely that you can look at them in a way as if you were an intellectual by being more skeptical, being willing to examine, not being afraid, and above all, exposing yourself. You see, a lot of us walk around like sheep. The idea is to try to think for yourself.
But is it not true that in the last 2 or 3 decades there has been much more encouragement to students to think for themselves than there was before World War II, that the idea that received nostrums are now shoved down people's throats, more vigorously than ever before, is simply not true?
You're right. I mean, there's been a great questioning. I think part of the intellectual activity of this century has been a debunking of old gods, and there's been a tradition of demythologizing. But one of the things that troubles me as part of this is that people learn how to do that and only that. In other words, the idea of debunking, of not accepting received truth, can itself become a kind of method, and then you do it automatically. I'm not interested in that, because in the end, it becomes fashion. You accept a fashion today and tomorrow you get another one. Like in literary studies, it was, deconstruction or post-structuralism, one thing after the other. Where do you anchor yourself? Is it possible to be consistent without being rigid?
Well, of course, your critics say that you are consistent in views which they find unacceptable. In a recently published book, published in this country this year, Culture and Imperialism, you argue about the way that you see literature and the imperial idea being interconnected, and that has produced a torrent of, some of it fairly vicious criticism in this country, saying that you've been motivated by hatred almost of imperialism, particularly British, to some extent American, and that
French
too. Okay, I'm sorry I missed them out.
No,
and that this wasn't fresh thinking on your part which produced a startling thesis which angered some people, but it was in fact a consistent thesis because of your own background, springing from the Arab world. You couldn't accept this, and so you looked for evidence even in Jane Austen.
Right. Well, I must confess, that sounds like a caricature of what I said as I thought about
I'm merely reporting the views as they were.
I thought many of the English reviews were inaccurate in that way. The whole point of the book, actually, is to show, that even in as wonderful an aesthetic object as a Jane Austen novel, you do find references to the slave trade, to the Caribbean islands that were part of the British Empire. And yet, I go on to argue, and this is the second part of my thesis, or my idea, is that the empire is still, in many ways, is with us. I mean, that is to say, that I grew up in the empire. It's not a matter of reviling it. It is a matter of understanding the way in which we are connected to those ideas.
And of acknowledging that it's always been there.
And it's always been there. And it's no use shoving it under the rug and saying, well, Jane Austen's all about country houses. Of course, her novels are about country houses and gentry. But they also deal with these other ideas in a relatively loose and quick way. And what I'm interested in, more than anything else, is the way in which politics and culture really work together. It's not about reviling them. On the contrary, I think it's possible to appreciate the density and the beauty of a Dickens novel or an Austen novel from that point of view, because they weren't only read by English people. I mean, I grew up as an Arab reading Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, but I read it with different emphases, you see. And I think that makes it into a more interesting object.
Well, we're at a very interesting point here where the theme of the lectures and a lot of your work of literary criticism and social criticism recently come together in your own history, your own background.
Right.
Now, you were born in Jerusalem as a Palestinian Arab. You had a strange upbringing in that you went to an English Christian, obviously, school. You were baptized, I think, as an Episcopalian.
That's right.
Now, to what extent has that experience coloured really all your thinking on matters touching on the imaginative life and on society?
Well, it convinced me, first of all, that none of us, not even the English individual or the Arab individual, is purely that. In other words, I was born purely as an Arab. Both my parents were Arabs, right? And yet I was born in this community and grew up in English-speaking schools at the same time that I was an Arab. In the same way that I argue in many of the English novels, for example, you find mentions of Indians and Chinese and so on and so forth. So the one thing that is consistent in everything I've done is really to treat cultures as in fact mixed. They're not pure. And that the idea of a pure race or a pure culture is a complete myth. It has nothing to do with the reality. So in that respect, I think my upbringing really does play an important role in and my history. It's just an acknowledgement of not only my history, but all our histories, that we're all mixed in with each other in ways. And what's interesting is to try to see them that way, which is what music taught me how to do, because when you listen to a piece of music, you don't just listen to the tune, you don't listen to one line, you try and listen to all of the piece. And I think that's the way to read culture.
Well, of course, that upbringing has given you a certain way of looking at the world. It's given you a place on which to stand.
Yes.
It's also taken you into raw politics.
Right.
You've been a tireless advocate for the Palestinian cause in the United States, not always an easy row to hoe
Very difficult,
there.
very difficult.
And of course, as a result, you have been accused of being, Arafat's man in New York
Right,
and so on,
right.
and every single piece of PLO policy has been put at your door. Now, can you just explain for people who may be vaguely familiar, or perhaps not familiar at all, with your exact position on this matter, before these lectures begin, where you stand and what your current thinking on that issue is, because it is important.
Well, I'll begin by saying that what I teach in America and what I've always taught for the 30 years I've been at Columbia is entirely English and comparative literature. I've never taught the Middle East, although I've written about it, and of course I've spoken about it. I've been an advocate of Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian human rights, which is really what interests me the most, because it interests me in every place. I happen to come from a community that has been dispossessed as a nation. Our people, my whole family was made refugees in 1948, and I grew up in an atmosphere where one couldn't get away from this problem, even though one was a professional literary critic. In the end, it caught up with one. So in that respect, I've played a role as an advocate, as you say, and I've always remained independent, on the other hand. I've never joined any parties. I've never had any official position of any kind. I do what I do out of commitment. I don't get money for it. I just do it because I think it's the right thing to do, as I, for example, defended Salman Rushdie or spoke up against the various invasion of Panama, Nicaragua, and so on. I live in America. I see myself both as an American and a Palestinian. I'm a sort of amphibious creature. And I've always maintained a scrupulous independence, so that if I feel that Palestinian policies, say, from the PLO, have been mistaken, I speak up about it. I say it publicly. But in America, you don't get any points. Anybody can attack Arabs and Palestinians in America. I think it's much harder and much more challenging to talk about things that are difficult to talk about, namely the abuse of Palestinian human rights.
What is your view of Zionism?
My feeling is that Zionism is a movement that did wonders for Jews in the diaspora. But so far as the Palestinians, who were the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine when the movement began at the end of the 19th century, it was a catastrophe. And historically, Zionism has produced a welfare state for Jews. But in equal measure, it has produced one disaster after another for Palestinians, dispossessed them, taken their lands, destroyed their lives, distorted their outlook and their economy. And for the last 26 years, Israel has been in military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza to the enormous detriment of the Palestinian people.
How do you prevent your essential feeling, which I take it to be that Zionism is fundamentally a racist idea, from spilling
No,
into...
I wouldn't say racist.
Okay,
no,
well, that's interesting. You see, one of the problems in this whole argument, as
Right.
you know, the issue is that if you move towards a position where you
Right.
believe that Zionism is racist, you then tip over perhaps even without knowing it, into anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Now,
No,
I
I've been
want
very
to know
careful about that.
where you are on that spectrum.
No, I for example, in everything I've written, I say Zionism is Zionism. It has a particular quality to it. It's unlike most other forms of political ideology, and I try to look at it only in terms of what it's done to the Palestinians, acknowledging at the same time that it may have done wonders for Jews. So in that respect, I challenge anyone to find any hint even of anti-Semitism in what I write, because I mean, after all, my associations, both historically in the world I grew up in Palestine and Egypt, was there were Jews intermingled with us. I mean, it was an open society that way. And of course in America.
Well, I was going to say, in academic life in New York.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, you are in a community which has got an enormous representation
That's
of
right.
Jewish intellectuals,
Right.
I mean, of liberal and conservative outlook.
Right.
Do you find life difficult at all in that respect?
No, I wouldn't have stayed there if I hadn't. I mean, no, I love it, of course, and I've had many opportunities to leave New York, and I wouldn't live anywhere else. It's the most exciting and perhaps dangerous in many respects city on earth. But you know, my association with Jews as students and as colleagues and so on and so forth is so natural to me that, you know, it's quite easy to go on. And of course, when the question of Israel comes up, then of course everybody knows what my position is, and then they feel that they have to take a position, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
You talked earlier about the idea of the intellectual being one that has to involve going against the grain, standing outside.
Yes.
That obviously is reflected in your own history. Do you partly enjoy that kind of argument, civilized argument, in New York because you are very original in regard to your background?
Well, you know, sometimes you wish it wasn't so frequent that you are seen only as a Palestinian. I mean, in other words, everything you say is, he really is pushing a Palestinian line. I mean, nobody's that simple-minded, obviously, as that. So it's difficult to say which came first. I mean, I can't really say I enjoy it. It's just something to which I've become accustomed.
That's one of the influences on your intellectual approach to things. You mentioned earlier that music has been another one which is very important. And you talked about the way it had taught you to look at things in a certain way, or at least to analyse them in a certain way, to feel them in a certain way. How important is music to you?
Well, tremendously important, because I've played the piano all of my life. And I'm a great listener of music. I obviously like to play, but also listen, and opera is something that means a great deal to me. And I write about music, and what is particularly important about it, A, is that it's not verbal, right? It's a different way of thinking that is very plastic, very dynamic, and it's very sentient, it's very passionate, without words. And the second thing about it that is tremendously important is I like, in particular, a kind of music that is contrapuntal. In other words, music with many lines and voices in it. And that, in fact, has taught me really to read differently. In other words, when you read a book, it's very easy to just read along and to see what's on the page. But if, at the same time that you're reading, you're able to hear other voices that went into the making of this book but were crowded off the page in some way, or you could see references in the work that are held in abeyance, for example, I think that's the most important thing, to be able to think in a plastic and innovative, but also in a way that you relate to other things. You're not just focused in a monomaniacal way on only one thing.
So where does that interest in music lead you in your tastes? If you're looking for music which has tremendous complexity and the sense of a theme that is overarching over a whole piece and that stimulates the intellect by giving it a structure, where does that take you in music?
Wagner and Strauss. I mean, the German as opposed to the Italian school. I mean, for reasons that I couldn't possibly explain, I detest Verdi. Most Verdi, anyway. I love Rossini, on the other hand, and Mozart, too. I think probably a certain kind of opera with a complexity that isn't, in the end, melodramatic. Verdi is just awfully noisy, and there's a lot of, brothers killing sisters and so on.
We could talk about that for a long time,
yes,
but
right,
perhaps, let us get back to Wagner. Why is Wagner so wonderful?
Well, I mean, Wagner strikes me as he advertised himself as a kind of universal, producing universal artworks. I mean, there's very little you can't find in Wagner. A lot of it is actually quite vague, but so you can put your own mind to working as to what, for example, Nibelung is all about.
But it is the fusion of the music drama.
Exactly, it's the fusion of these incredibly disparate elements that all come together in the final analysis in his music. I mean, Wagner as a stage designer is not something any of us experiences today, but you do hear it in the music in astonishing ways. All of the operas. I don't like the early operas so much, but say from Meistersinger on, The Ring and so on.
And so you enjoy the sense of being let loose in a symbolic landscape,
right,
really,
which requires a great deal of discipline, but requires a
structures.
certain basic discipline. I mean, I think you have to know what he's doing musically. It's not a question of just dreaming about it.
But you seem to be saying that what music has done for you is to show you how you can impose that discipline in your own mind?
No, not so much, yes, impose it on your mind as opposed to imposing it on his music, yes. In other words, in order to follow the music, you have to be disciplined yourself in attention. There's a lot going on, and you're required to think in, you might say, complicated as opposed to simple ways. Right.
Do you think that's one of the problems with intellectual life as you're looking at it in these lectures, that too often people set off down tram lines,
Right.
that they don't move to the side and think about things in quite a different way, from a different point of view, and indeed in a completely different way, as you've described
Right.
through music?
Right. Yes, I think that is one of the great problems. I mean, it's what I call professionalism. In other words, you're tracked, right? And you go to school, and then the higher you climb in the education ladder, so to speak, in the hierarchy, the more specialized you become, and the line gets narrower. And by the end, most people, I mean, a lot of my students, for example, will end up as dentists or lawyers or professors, right? But they'll end up by doing that one thing supremely well, with a kind of technical expertise that crowds out every other considerations. And I'm against that. I mean, it's produced so many problems, not only in morality, but even in just in the way you think. You know, it's really a form of exclusion. Specialization as crowding things out, pushing them away. And I'm much more interested, and there's a certain kind of predictability, you know, that a supreme technician, let's say, in the computer is only going to do that. Whereas it seems to me what's much more interesting, and I have this idea about intellectuals, which I get from 19th century novels, that when you first see the intellectual, let's say, in a novel by Turgenev, Bazarov, right, he doesn't seem to have a story behind him. He just sort of pops up, and he does this disruptive thing, and then he suddenly dies. So you can't plot his career simply. And this idea of the intellectual as somebody who moves by interest and a certain set of values rather than by predictable career is what I'm most interested in.
If one of the threats to the vitality of intellectual life is the way that people are specialized and they go into a career and so on, surely another is something which is being much commented on here, as in the United States at the moment, the whole doctrine of political correctness, or however we describe it, the idea that there are fixed rules within which you must operate for fear of offending someone, which in itself is that same kind of restriction on free thought, isn't it?
Right,
Does that worry you?
Of course it does. I mean, because I teach at a university. But I think the diagnosis is correct, that there is a lot of political correctness. I think the reason given for it, usually by people on the extreme right in America who bring up political correctness, is that this is part of a left-wing cabal. You know, people are taught to think in a kind of orthodox, you know, presumably mirroring commissars in the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. I mean, that's absolute nonsense. It isn't a left cabal. The universities are solidly conventional in most instances, controlled, if that's the right word, by basically middle-of-the-road people, right? But I think the problem of political correctness is not any of those things, therefore, but laziness. It's much easier to do it that way. You follow, you comply. I mean, it's what in
if
the banking industry.
Behave, you
yes,
don't
exactly.
think about how you behave.
You don't have to think about what the consequences are. You know, because somebody said it, therefore you follow it. So it's compliant. It's sheep-like behavior, and nothing is more infuriating in the end, and nothing is a greater enemy, because it really means in the end, you know, I'm doing what I told.
So if the place of the intellectual should be of great concern to us all, and it is, by implication, a battle that has to be fought, how should that battle be fought by people who care about it?
Well, I think it has to be fought in language. I think that the principal fortress to be defended by the intellectual, if one wants to speak in military terms, is really the right to free speech, really, in the end. I mean, I think if you try to abrogate the right to dissent, to say things that are unpopular, the things that go against traditional or canonical authorities, and so on and so forth, in the end, you're really taking away intellectual freedom. So I think that's the main issue. And how does intellectual freedom manifest itself? Of course, there's the physical act of being able to get something into print, but in the end, it's really a use of language. It's a sensitive, responsive, serious use of language that is about the reality in which we live. Reality is complicated. I'm not saying that you can do it quickly, but I think that's where the issue is fought.
Do you see the corruption of the language, as you've talked about it, as something which is going on, which is getting worse, which shows no signs of stopping?
Yes, I think it is. I think the media plays a tremendous role in this. That is to say, the euphemisms. I mean, for example, during the Gulf War, you couldn't look at American television and not be literally inundated, drenched in cliches, all of them designed to, for example, curtain off the reality, which was horrible. I mean, people were being killed. First of all, no bodies were shown. I mean, television can do that. Second of all, you talk about things like surgical strikes, or collateral damage, right? And third, and perhaps more insidious than anything, is the notion of we were fighting. You know, I remember one of the newscasters in America, after a news broadcast during the Gulf War, actually saluted as there was a picture of troops going on off on a battleship to fight in Iraq. He saluted as if it was the national duty of everyone to do that. But I think that is the enemy of independent thought.
Well,
really.
the use of the word we, I can see the point you're making, but you would use the word about the Palestinian people,
yes,
about whom you care, and you would use that without embarrassment.
No, exactly, because I don't pretend. I mean, I'm not, you know, a newspaper person is saying this is the news, you know, and that's the CBS used to conclude in America its news broadcast was saying, and that's the way it is. The New York Times, across the top of its page, the news that's fit to print. I don't make any pretense of that kind of quote-unquote objectivity. I'm objective to the extent that I tell the truth, but I'm a partisan, of course. Everybody is of one side or another, I think, absolutely.
But does this mean that you are, in the end, rather pessimistic about the way the intellectual life, if we use that phrase, is going to develop?
I think in the end one has to be pessimistic intellectually, but you know, optimistic by virtue of one's will. It doesn't mean you stop, and neither can you become cynical. I mean, cynical is saying that everybody does it, therefore why bother? I mean, I think those are the enemies, the cynics, because they're the ones who say there's no hope. I mean, the more you try to improve things, the more you're really lending yourself to a futile effort. I think things can be changed. I do think so. They're hard to do, but they have to be done everlastingly. I don't think you can stop and say, well, I've done my work, I can now go back and listen to some more Wagner.
Do you worry that the way that society is going, Western society anyway, means that the cynics are almost inevitably going to be in charge, or at least in control, more than those who try to assert the necessity for the independence of the human spirit, or whatever we call it?
No, I don't think it's the cynics in the end who worry me the most. I think it's the enthusiasts. I mean, in the part of the world from which I come, the big issue today are the religious movements, you know, and I think it's not, by the way, restricted to Islam. I mean, there's Jewish fundamentalism, there's Christian fundamentalism, and that, to me, is the portent of the future. Tribalism of the kind you see that leads to separatism. I mean, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Lebanese Civil War. There's a lot of alarm in the United States about this. You know, Arthur Schlesinger, the famous historian, wrote a book called The Disuniting of America. I think that is a problem. People who are so convinced that theirs is the only truth, they can't live with anybody else, and they really go forward with a kind of millenarian vision, leading people to destruction. I think that's the greatest, probably, danger.
And where does the thesis that you're going to expand in these lectures and the point that you're going to make touch on that argument? Where do those two things come together? Your concern about the kind of lives we're all going to lead, whether we're engaged in intellectual discourse or not, and what the thinkers do. How do they come together?
They come together, I think, in one extremely, to me, significant way, which I talked about in my book on culture and imperialism. That is to say, they cannot come together in identity politics, thinking about yourself. You have to be able to think about yourself and others. I mean, that's the basic issue. If you are focused exclusively on yourself, your tribe, your flag, your nation, then that's a certain recipe for A, the end of thought, and B, the end of civilized life as we know it. You have to be able to think in terms of yourself as part of something larger than yourself. Not your own nation, but other nations, the interdependence of peoples and cultures. That's the main idea.
Professor Said, thank you very much indeed.
James Naughtie was in conversation with Edward Said, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Columbia. And you can hear his first Reith lecture, Representations of the Intellectual, on Radio 4 at 8:45 next Wednesday evening. The producer was Anne Winder.